To begin with, a bit of brief pedagogue stuff. There's a whole range. I'll talk a little bit about Galamian. He's very general. As always, he's general but kind of spot on. Here, a couple of quotes. Allow a comfortable and efficient execution of all playing movements. Well, no one's going to disagree with that. Galamian also says each player is an individual with their own physique and mental approach. That's also very useful, while very general. I'll talk about that later on, about when we're trying to reform, reprogram a student's setup. Say they've got a very difficult setup and lots of things are not working well for them. We need to be very careful how we unpick that, how we unpack that setup, because often it's associated with the feeling of how musical they are a lot. So we have to be careful with how we unpick those things. The second pedagogue that we should all look at, I know is very familiar to most of you, but Paul Rowland is also going back a long time. Time for some very new radical pedagogy out there. But Paul Rowland, basically his whole work is about balance and setup. So some of his quotes: an awareness of the self in feeling and visualizing the efficient movement will help develop a good technique, tone and style. Again, it's stating the very, very obvious. Another thing that is particularly Rowland, other people have taken it up, is when he talks about static tension. This is a really good exercise in a group lesson or in a pedagogy class. I always get pedagogy class to do kind of, they set themselves, as they set, player A, set themselves up in the most comfortable position they can imagine, and they spend a few minutes getting ready and testing all their joints and things. And then if you put the clock on and wait for about 30 seconds, they're feeling increasingly uncomfortable. And after about a minute is quite a long time in a class with no one moving, it gets quite difficult to hold this position. I mean, it's pretty obvious that the body, we evolved to move, and if we can't find that movement in playing, we're going to create problems later on. And if our setup and our use of the body doesn't allow movement, including micro movements that we're barely aware of, we will have more problems. Often get students to do some basic basketball jumps. This is hardly radical. I'll try and change my camera angle. So the head goes out of shot, of course, but by the time we've finished from the basketball jumps, hopefully we have loose knee joints, we have loose ankle joints, and hopefully that looseness goes all the way through to these joints that we associate a lot with playing. Again, this is very familiar to a lot of you. Try and put the violin in. This is a very conscious setting up of the violin. Put it in with the right hand. So many times when we see a student, they get ready to play and they go like that. So they come forward to meet the violin, the shoulder goes up and the head either goes there or the head goes like that. So it's a very common thing. So if they just pop it in the left with the right hand, put it into position here at the jaw, slide it down to position and swing their arms. If we have the balance between 2 feet, it doesn't matter where the feet are. Actually, almost no one plays with the right foot forward. So long as there's a balance and you can move freely between the two is really, really important. This also affects rhythm and articulation. So we often say, look for the rhythmic problem, look towards the bow, but then we go a step further, look beyond the bow arm and look to the balance in the body. So we don't need to have rigid ideas about where the thumb is. We work with basic principles, and one of the basic principles is that the thumb needs to be available to move, just like every part of the body when playing the violin needs to be available to move. Some general principles still: favor balance over stability, communicate the feel of balance. So we listen, we see, this is what we do as teachers, and we feel, except we can't feel how they feel. We can listen to how they play, we can see to a fairly high level what they do, but we have to build in them that kinesthetic response. We have to build in them working with how it feels and try and get them to work with constructive use of feeling. Another way to challenge awareness, challenge the way they feel, challenge what they're doing, is to use props. So a very familiar one to lots of you is to support the violin. If the violin isn't being held by the jaw, the collarbone, the hand or whatever, you just shove it on top of a music stand and even put it quite high. they learn that freedom. It's like training wheels on the bike. How do we learn to have the momentum? We learn to have the momentum by having the training wheels, which means we don't worry, we go quite fast. From that speed we get momentum, from the momentum we get balance. So we have that freedom. It's just the violin in the collar, into the neck, resting on the collarbone, supported by the hand. It's a very, very useful thing for them to do. Okay, cons against playing without a shoulder rest? Large descending shifts from high positions are more difficult. So you have to program extra movements of the thumb. This can be easily done. But if the student doesn't want to do that, well then that's a difficulty for them, a constant difficulty when playing, especially repertoire that moves around quite a lot from high positions to low without the rest. When we play very high, and for a smaller hand person and smaller hand student, when they have to leave the security of the neck and go either onto the edge of the fingerboard there, or around to the violin, to do vib or to do vibrato, or even to feel at all comfortable there with finger four, often you have to raise the shoulder to support the violin. That's an unusual situation, but it is one to talk about with them. Okay, so playing with the rest, the pros basically give stability and downward shifts and vibrato, as we said. One thing we need to be careful of is it can become a band-aid solution. So it can cover up underlying technical tensions, especially in shifting. So one really useful thing to do is to get the student to be able to take the violin away. So you take hold of the violin as well and pull it away, and just see where their left shoulder is. So often they'll say, no, I'm not raising my left shoulder at all, but when you take away the violin, you see that they really are. So because it's against something inanimate, they don't feel what they're doing with the shoulder. So I use the analogy of a shoulder bag. You're carrying a computer and a computer bag or something. As you're walking along, instinctively you're lifting your shoulder a little bit to stop it slipping off. So that's a kind of a feeling we can have with a shoulder rest. We need to teach setup in a measured manner. So there's an obsessive tendency. It's the nature of, what's the definition of a violinist? There could be or a viola player, many definitions of a violinist. One of them is that we have a strong desire. We have to be very careful with the perfectionist streak or the obsessive streak. And this is very true for us as teachers when we're working on setup, and again for the more advanced player when they're taking that on for themselves. So as I said before, we need to acknowledge players' physiques. Uncle Armin pointed this out: the length of neck, length of arm, size and stretch of hand, size of thumb compared to fingers. So when students have an incredibly low thumb but a very long thumb, I say, well, there's no need to hide the thumb. If you've got a long thumb, just let it sit where it wants to sit. That's a very important thing when setting up the left hand. Topic for another time. But so when we're talking about physical setup with shoulder rest and chin rest, the longer the neck, the more we're going to fill up the gap with certain things. Try not to do it all with the shoulder rest. Obviously, if some of the load is taken by a higher chin rest, I use a relatively high chin rest, and some of the shoulder rest, that's a better compromise. It doesn't mean, as I said before, you can't play, if you've got a long neck, you can still, of course, play without a shoulder rest, but the head, unless you have an incredibly high chin rest, the head is going to come further down. But it's one of the variables to think about. If we've got a long neck, we need to think about filling it up with a variety of things. The length of arm is important. Depends where the violin sits. If you've got a short arm, to get a straight bow, I can't even see myself with that bow straight enough. But if I push the violin much further to the left, often, especially the younger student likes to have the violin round towards onto the left shoulder. They feel more secure like that. You often see that kind of thing. Now, there's no reason why you can't do that, of course, so long as they don't lift the shoulder and so long as they don't twist the head all the way around there. But if you've got a short arm and you just physically can't reach to get to the tip there. So if you've got a shorter arm player, they need to have the violin more in towards the center. And if you've got a longer arm player, they can have it more out to the left if they want. One thing we often don't talk about much is the sliding across the neck. So angles seem all right, everybody. That is one of the things we can do. Sometimes we're not aware, the student just looks very uncomfortable and we say, well, where's your angle here? That seems fine. Where's the angle here? That seems fine. And it could be that they're really pushing, most of the violin is pushing past the contact of the neck. One of Roland's guides, his general principles was that the button of the violin should be in the neck. He doesn't specify where in the neck. It can be in many different places. But if we get to the point where the button, I don't know if you can see that, is pushing into the air, it's a very unstable violin hold. So that's one thing that I really push quite a lot. When they come down to position, the button of the violin needs to go into the neck. And the more feeling of the violin being into the neck, the more secure the hold. Again, I often talk about how do we hold anything. So if we hold something valuable, and pencil's not very valuable, like this, it's much less secure than if we hold it into the hand. This is a very secure way of holding the pencil. So again, if we hold the violin like this, it feels much more secure than that. So this part of the violin isn't into the neck. There tends to be many more problems with their reliability of violin hold, of setup. We can observe patterns of use. So this is one of Alexander's big principles, that the toddler is a holy example of body use, totally free and admirable in the world. And gradually the toddler observes what adults, what other people do with their bodies and learns different models of use. It seems to me patently true. And so we just don't expect someone coming to the violin or cello for the first time to necessarily have good body use. And just that final note of caution, be aware of taking away things too fast. So setting up the bow, let's again talk about some basic principles. Go back to Gleiming, go back to many of our basic pedagogues. He talks a lot about springs. I use the word trampolines as well. Our trampolines have springs, so they must be related there somehow. The springs, joints are basically springs. So we talk to students about when they watch a large plane land, which most of them have seen, and how that incredible force is absorbed. And where is it absorbed? They always say it's absorbed by the wheels or the tires of the plane, and then you get them to think about it and they say, well, no, that wouldn't work. The wheels would smash or whatever. And then you get them to think about those huge springs that go woof, 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 as the plane gradually settles into the ground. All that weight, still a high level of speed, so a high friction impact, even with the best pilot landing the plane. And it's the same for us with so many things we do where the joints have to absorb that impact. So we go back, we talk about the springs, and one of the most common springs that are ignored are what we call the bass knuckles, falsely called the bass knuckles, but it's pretty general in the violin cello community to talk about these knuckles as the bass knuckles. And when I say trampolines, I just get them to go down and get them to go up, get them to go down. And so often they spend their time, they'll lock their first finger around, they'll lose contact with the fourth finger, that will be locked or something, and the knuckles will be locked up. So when they land, the bow jitters, they don't have a smooth feeling. They don't even like playing in the lower half because they can't release the pressure of the first finger. One of the first things to do, this is talking about an immediate standard student, grade 5, 6 or whatever, is just some really simple things for them to do, or get a better angle. So call it the trampoline down, go all the way down, the thumb still has to be curved, the first finger has released its sideways contact with the bow, and the fourth finger on the bow, I hope you can see that, is very curved. Okay, so that's an extreme down position, and that's an extreme up position. Most of the time we're playing in the mid position. I'll talk about that more, the neutral position, the midline position. And so often students, and yeah, all levels, play with too high. And the reason they play with the knuckles too high is just because they're not letting them release. Another basic principle for the fingers, what's active and passive? We could actually say for all parts of the arm, all parts of the body, what is active and passive? Speed is a variable I think we don't talk about enough, but we need to think about what's active and what's passive. So in terms of that, the collet action, which I'm a bit of a collet nut, is active. It's always active. So active fingers curling on the up bow, active fingers straightening on the down bow. And since they're actively moving, when we leave into the air, we have to reform the hand. Initiation is another principle, basic principle. And I often say to the student, well, actually what I'm saying now is anatomically incorrect, but think of it anyway. So when we say, a stroke, a détaché stroke, when we initiate the détaché stroke, I say things like, feel the forearm initiating the stroke. Now all the body use people, all the neurologists, all the headbangers in all these areas say that's actually incorrect. We do not initiate with the forearm. That is not something that we initiate. We initiate with a fingertip that sends a message to the brain, sends back, blah, blah, blah. To me, that's, so long as you acknowledge that with the student, it can be a very useful thing to say. So especially a student that has a very locked whole arm stroke, so actually stop the whole arm, stop the backward movement of the whole arm, of the upper arm, and say initiate with the forearm. So this is a very old thing. We get them to play against a music stand or get them to play against a wall. But initiation is a basic principle I think we need to think a lot about when talking about the bow. Upper half is generally lighter than the lower half. We also need to, so we talk about the weight, and that affects what strokes we use. We also need to talk about how much the hair gives, which means actually how much does the bow stick give. At the heel it doesn't give so much, the bow stick gives a little bit and the hair gives a little bit. In the middle, our softer spot, both give a lot. It's a lovely spot. And the balance point already, for smooth landing, the balance point's so good because there's a lot of give there. The tip of the bow, there's very little movement in the wood. Okay, so this is again something we need to think about. They don't necessarily need to think about. So when we play martelé, hook stroke, the upper half of the bow is usually a much better place to do it because it's a brittle part. We get a lot of reaction to our pressure. So especially younger students have bows with very bad thumb leathers. Robert Gerler, who wrote The Art of Practicing the Violin, was obsessed with this. And it seems to me an incredibly important thing, a really basic thing, that when we loosen the bow, I hope you can see this, basically the frog ought to almost touch the thumb leather. So when we tighten the bow to plain pressure, plain tension, it gives roughly the right amount of distance for the thumb to fit in. So the thumb should obviously have some contact with the thumb leather, some contact with the wood in between, and some contact with the edge of the frog. It's amazing how many students actually have their thumb in the frog when you're trying to, and sometimes they hide it. So I've got my thumb in the frog now. The bow hold feels absolutely dreadful, and if I played, I'm sure it'd be dreadful. And it's kind of hidden. So many things about the thumb are hidden. So obviously, it's such a catchy place that the student thinks, oh, there's this lovely gap here. That's where I put my thumb. Okay. So it's stating the obvious that they shouldn't put the thumb in there. Changes the whole balance of the hand. But part of it is that often their thumb leather is way too thin. It's often put way too high, miles away. So there's no support for their thumb at all. So I always recommend younger teachers having a real look at every bow. Let's talk a little bit now about the bow hold. So the role of the fingers and the thumb. Okay, so the forefinger is pretty clear, sits on top of the bow hold, supports the bow in the air. This is all very familiar to you. And we have this kind of middle ring, which again is very familiar. The thumb, in my opinion, sits on the right hand edge. I don't know if you can see, and it goes into the bow like that, but this kind of basic ring between 2 and 3. I never fuss too much about saying the basic ring is between 2 and thumb. Again, it depends where the thumb is sitting, how long the thumb is, how long the second finger is. To me, the basic ring there is between 2 and 3 and thumb, roughly. Fourth finger on top, 2 and 3 and thumb make that ring. The thumb, of course, I've long given up talking about the thumb being curved. Of course, it doesn't want to be locked, it doesn't want to be straight, but a more useful way of approaching it is if I poke the thumb, does it give? So that's a fairly curved thumb, it pokes and gives. This is a fairly straight thumb, I don't know if you can see. It also gives. Both are fine. And one of the most basic exercises is half bow martelets. Again, you could do this at quite a young stage. It doesn't need to be a total martelet. Do the lower half of the stick with the fourth finger on the bow, first finger in the air, then what we call swap the fingers. So first finger down, fourth finger off, swap. Of course, you can do that with more segments. Whole bow martelet, I'll talk about a bit later when we talk about martelet, is a very, very useful stroke, but that feeling of going from 1 to 4, it's also a good thing to practice with the bow on the string. Tap the 4, tap the 1. So that kind of feeling, which, you go back to Roland, Sheila Nelson, all those people, all the clock positions, or letting the bow fall onto the string, lifting it up with the fourth finger for basic ricochet. It's a very useful thing to do. So the first finger, being very aware of what the first finger does. And when do we need the first finger? We almost never need the first finger in the lower half. We don't need the first finger in retakes. It feels more secure having the first finger on the bow always, but we don't actually need it. So 3-note chords, I get them to do 3-note chords without the first finger. Of course, it feels quite insecure to begin with. But if they're doing the right thing with their bass knuckles, if their thumb's in a good position, if the wrist is not too tight, it's fine. I'm a fan of basically teaching the détaché with the forearm. I know people teach it with the hand. To me, there's nothing wrong with teaching it with the hand. It seems to me, especially in the developmental stage, it's much better to get the forearm working, and one of the most central joints we often talk about, the wrists. Maybe we talk too much about the wrist. The wrist needs to be, the basic job of the wrist in life is to be soft and flexible and giving. Apart from that, it doesn't actually do that much. So long as it gives, we're pretty content with our wrists. The bass knuckles, I focus on quite a lot. And the ball and socket shoulder joints, okay, they're really, really important. And we do use that stroke from the ball and socket in the lower half of the bow. But the elbow hinge, it's a pretty basic joint, a pretty simple joint, is one of the easiest ones to lock as students begin to play fast. I teach détaché fairly seriously to do with the forearm, teach it in the middle of the bow to begin with. So long as they're opening the elbow hinge, it doesn't matter where they start. Obviously, if they start, I've got to remember to stand back. Obviously, if they start too low in the bow, it's a very strong impetus to use the whole arm, because in that part of the bow, we like to use the whole arm. Give any 3-year-old a violin, and the first thing they'll do is, if they look at some of the really great players, they see some astonishingly crooked bows. So long as the sound is clear and the coordination is good and the resonance is good, that no one cares how straight. You don't complain about Kramer's bow if it's crooked or not. So teaching détaché in the middle. Once we do get into the issues of the straightness of the bow, and especially when we get into hook stroke, I'm a big fan of the Galamian in and out. So as it's one of those interesting things. I believe it's core to a bowing technique but actually we use it very little. Like I believe collé is core to a bowing technique, but we actually use it very little in performance. So you could say, question my use of the core. I think it's very good. It allows enormous flexibility and control in the bow stroke to do collé, and similarly to be able to have the upper arm come forward. We don't have to use that to have a straight bow. We can do different things with the hand and the wrist, but when we're playing fast, and I'll especially get into this with ricochet and hook stroke, martelé, it's very good if the upper arm can come forward on the down bow, and especially very good that it can go back on the up bow. That's an important thing. Détaché being the core stroke, the pivotal stroke, martelé is basically détaché in the similar parts of the bow, similar actions to do with straightening the bow. The main thing we need to do is just add a bit of friction. You could try 1, 2, 3, hold the friction, then bow, and as we bow, we release. So 1, 2, 3, hold, go into the air. The purpose of martelé, again we use martelé not a huge amount in the repertoire. Early classical material, we don't necessarily call it martelé, we call very staccato strokes or whatever, kind of. More like a brush stroke, but it's a fantastic, like collé, a fantastic stroke for practicing. It's fantastic for coordination. It insists, just like with pizzicato, it insists the fingers go down together, that the fingers have got equal balance, that the sound works together. So pizzicato is a very good thing for practicing a lot of passage work. Martelé, it encourages a very active finger movement and a very precise and in time finger movement. It's very common that the student, once they get engaging the bow into the string or the grip, if you will, that they leave it there. And which is not what we're looking for in martelé at all, but it takes a while to develop. So you could say this is a really good time to just use the first finger in a very strong way. So put the first finger on, engage the string. As you bow, take the first finger off. It gives, because most of the pressure or the adding of friction comes on the first finger. By lifting it off, it helps them develop the release. It's a fantastic training stroke for us, because to get the rebound, again, we have to have the energy in the little notes, just like in a martelé, and then it immediately has to release into a different bow. Again, you can practice a martelé by engaging the string, then going into the air, and then leaving it in the string like that. Teach hook stroke in the various forms. Down up is maybe the most straightforward. Up down, exactly the same principles, and then the length is also useful to practice. Spiccato, to me, spiccato comes from the détaché stroke. Basically, everything comes from the détaché stroke. I teach a forearm spiccato just like I teach a forearm détaché. You can do a hand spiccato, a hand moving from the wrist. To me, the different change of bow angle, the width of the crookedness, if you will, of the hand is not so useful, and you find that people that students that are not quite on top of the hand spiccato often begin to use the arm instead of the whole arm. So you often get this, which is the worst of all, the crookedness and the hardest to control, how close we get to the string. So to me, I teach the forearm. The biggest problem with teaching the forearm is spiccato, especially when we're beginning to develop it, is happily about around this part of the bow, the balance point to the middle, and that's the part that they would associate with the whole arm stroke. So to me, I would favour the mechanics over the sound to begin with. I think this is something we just have to do sometimes. I would insist on opening the elbow hinge, insist on a forearm movement, and if they do it more in the middle of the bow and they have too high a bounce and the sound is not so great, that's fine. It's fairly easy to refine that stroke, just like in terms of that basic lower third stroke, which we use sometimes for sound. We can refine the crookedness of it later on, but let that be free for whole bow strokes. Again, for spiccato, use the forearm. Do I start above the string? It's a very good question. No, almost always we start kind of spiccato in ensemble playing and sometimes in solo playing from the string. In terms of training and developing the stroke, I think it's very good to start from the string, so long as the down bow is kind of the mirror image of the up bow. So it doesn't matter what angle you're on. We often talk about bananas. You mightn't be able to see this. This is the basic way of getting the silly bow off the string. Then we gradually add in some horizontal. And that's a very useful way to activate the spiccato stroke to begin with. Spiccato, like everything else, is speed dependent. The slower we go, the lower we go, usually more on the side of the hair to get a more lyrical sound. The faster we go, the higher in the stroke we can go. Sautier, to me, they're different strokes. I know some people believe, and there is a playing continuum from spiccato. Spiccato being every stroke is an activated stroke. There's no passive stroke in spiccato. The down bow is active. It finishes in the air much the same point as the up bow will finish. So that kind of, every spiccato stroke is active, but of course there is a continuum. We can go from active into the down bow being active in the sautier and the up bow being passive. So it can be a playing continuum. That doesn't worry me, but it seems to me really important that we teach them as different strokes. Spiccato is active, each stroke is activated, and sautier involves the rebound, just like hook stroke and just like vibrato is a rebound action. We can talk more about that. So Roland is, as I said, he's very good like this. You can't hear anything, but maybe you can see if I'm doing just a downward stroke there on the thumb. This is like spiccato. I'm just doing one bang, 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 bang. From sautier, when I get the bang down, I get a noise, but I also get the bang from when I hit the finger on the up. So it takes a while, like all these strokes. They take a while, and we just teach it in a structured manner. We all have our own system of teaching it, but to me, teaching that rebound action is really, really important. For them to get the feeling of a rebound, we often use a prop, like the leg, or a very useful thing to do is a hand. You can put out your own hand. So the screw of the bow hits the hand in exactly the same way with the same force every time, and then you know the sautier is working. If they start going everywhere, I mean, it's very clear to them also that the sautier isn't working. Very useful. Haven't spoken much about alternative bow holes, but when we've got continual problems in the bow hole, we can talk about our release, do our trampolines and our springs and our finger interchange. Really, really useful to just give them something else to work with. Roland talked about the Baroque bow hole, which can be very useful, but of course more problematic in the lower half. I use a lot thumb underneath. I hope you can see that. Not the thumb like that. I'm not a fan of that. We could talk about that later if you want. I use the straight thumb, and I know the thumb isn't straight when we put it in, and then we just put it in when it goes into the bow stroke. When it goes into the frog, it becomes curved. So that gives a nice arch. We're always looking for that ease. So thumb underneath is a very useful bow hold. Holding the remedial bow hold, holding the screw of the bow is very, very useful because it gets rid of the whole bow hold and any problems that it may present. Not a very sophisticated bow hold, but a very functional one. So when doing sortier, it's very good for them to hold the end here, just holding the screw. Give them a rhythmic unit. So what we're doing is activating the bounce. Okay, horizontal is dominant. When I do sortier, I break that plane. The down bow dips underneath the plane and bounces back slightly above the plane. Like with all these movements, getting back to setup, where we're doing something that's off kilter, off balance, very important that there's another part of the body, in this case the upper arm, that supports it. So you do all sorts of exercises with sortier to activate the upper arm bouncing back. So when my finger is strobing a bit for me, but you could say when the finger goes down, the upper arm is up. When the finger goes up, the upper arm is down. So if the upper arm is balancing, then it will absorb the impact of breaking the plane. Here I really disagree with Galamian. That's a brave statement, isn't it? But Galamian's very first finger focused when developing sortier. I don't find it particularly useful. Much more useful to do, say, if you need to develop more vertical action to help break the plane, if you will, do it with just 2 and 3. If you need to develop more horizontal action, you could use 1 and 3 on the bow, take off 2 and 4. But you could also do it without the first finger at all. And that's a very useful thing. The first finger can often crush the sortier stroke. So a very useful exercise for that to develop the string cross is to just do your sortier on the open string and then begin to move the violin so they learn how the sortier goes from string to string. That's a useful thing to do. The other, in my opinion, is basically an in-string stroke, relatively high friction, trying to keep the bow in the string. If you try and keep it in the string, you're going to have much more success from sortier than if you try and make it leave the string, whether it leaves the string a little bit or not. So sortier is a stroke to develop relatively early. It's pretty clear from our beloved Amy B that it's a good idea to develop it around 5th, 6th grade, maybe 4th grade, somewhere around that. And it's a fantastic stroke. Obviously developed its variants. We use brushstroke in classical music and things like that. Just like anything, the more we fill the space, if that certain student doesn't want to put themselves into the space, they don't really want to play, what is she playing, like Sicilian Rigodon or something, she doesn't really want to play that particularly well. She's very focused on the interaction with you, and maybe it's got a lot to do with her parents. You know, we can theorize, but a very simple thing is to just be quiet. So one of the things, especially from that level on, you might just let her play through something. So you play through something, and instead of saying this, you need to do this, I've told you this, do this, just often say, well, how can I help? And the first couple of times that you say that, they look at you in amazement. You're the teacher, my parents are paying you to teach, you tell me what to do. If you refuse to be part of that bargain, you say, well, how can I help? Okay, let's move on to something else. I haven't got anything else prepared. Well, let's do some duos. Okay, well, let's play some duets. I don't want to play duets. Okay, well, time to finish the lesson. It's probably time for you to be quite hardball about it, okay? So you've got this knowledge. I mean, every child understands the doctor. So they go to the doctor and the doctor says you take these pills or whatever, and they'll make you better. They don't question do the pills, what's in the pills, do I know they're really going to make me better? They either take them or whatever. They don't go to the doctor every week and say, I've got this pain again in my stomach. And the doctor says, well, have you done this? Oh, no, I haven't, but I still got the pain. So it's a really good time for us to refuse to kind of get into that circle. With some of my older students at maybe the opposite extreme, do absolutely everything that they think you've asked them to do, but still are very passive because they're always doing what you've asked them to do. It cuts both ways. The student that does nothing that you ask them to do drives you crazy. The student that only does what you tell them to do also drives you crazy. One of the advantages of this strange time we're living in is that they have to do quite a lot of monitoring themselves. So we can't really hear the sound quality, obviously, of what they're doing. Intonation, sometimes we miss, sometimes they're uncoordinated. We say, what was that like? But obviously they send you the unlisted YouTube clip for a student playing at a higher level. They send you an unlisted YouTube clip, and then you can actually go through that in the lesson. Okay, any feedback on the opening there? Oh, it was terrible. Or what specifically didn't you like about it? These kind of things.